Hi, and welcome back to Rooftop Recordings home recording video tutorial series. This is episode 3, my full drum miking setup. Now, it's been a while since I did the last video, so long in fact that my hair's been cut off. Between the time that the video was shot and the time that I'm finishing up the editing and post-production work, been busy with client work, which is a wonderful thing, but we will dig back in and get to treatment of all these drum tracks that we've worked on. And thanks for being here and watching. Be sure to click subscribe, click the notification bell, and we're going to launch right in. But before we do, this is not the only way that I record drums. This is just sort of the generic beginning approach that I might bring. Different drums are going to require something different, different kits, different projects, but this is sort of the standard default position that I begin with. So hope you enjoy. So we're going to do a 13 or 14 microphone drum setup, and I'm going to discuss each of the microphone placements. And before we do that, we're going to start talking about microphone choice. Now, the drum set, the core of the tone, as we've learned through the previous videos, is the overhead mics. So the overheads that I have to choose from, I want to have stereo. So it's a matter of what do I have stereo pairs of. It's possible to record drums without a matched stereo set, but I think in most cases you have greater options if you have matched stereo microphones. So these are all the microphones that I own stereo sets of. I have 3 different small diaphragm condenser stereo pairs. I have a pair of Cascade fat heads, which we've used in previous videos. I have a pair of 414 TL2s, and I have a pair of Mojave MA300s. So I just want to go briefly through why I might choose each of these microphones and explain the choice that I normally make on drum overheads. In small diaphragm condensers, Neumann KM184, Audio-Technica 4041, or Shure SM81s. I have stereo pairs of all of these, and they are definitely functional as overheads. Small diaphragm condensers tend to be brighter. They tend to be a little bit more detailed than a ribbon, for example. They're a very focused sound, and there's times that I choose my small diaphragm condensers as overheads. Generally, the brightest is the Audio-Technica. The Neumann is sort of the most realistic and smooth, and the SM81s have got a nice sort of mid-range punch to them. So depending on music style, jazz or very quiet folk, I may use the 4041s to be very bright. If somebody's playing with brushes, this would make an excellent choice. Really, any of the small diaphragm condensers. But for most sessions, I find them to be a little bit smaller sounding, and they tend to mostly just get the sound of the cymbals, and that tends to be a little brighter than I like for most styles of music. So we're going to pass on the small diaphragm condensers, and we'll use some of those in other spots. The Cascade fat heads they're excellent drum overheads. They take EQ really well, and as you've heard in the previous videos, if you've downloaded the audio tracks, which will be available for this session as well as the last 2 are already up on the first 2 videos, these work nicely for overhead miking. They're darker, but they're still very detailed, which means they get a lot of the slam and smack of the drums. With multiple mic, full drum miking, it's not as necessary as it would have been in previous setups. So for the sake of variety anyway, I'm going to bypass the ribbons today. So that leaves me with 414 or Mojave MA300. I use both of these from time to time for overheads. The 414 is a solid state transformerless microphone. The Mojave is a tube, which means it has a transformer. So very different large diaphragm condensers, and what difference that I hear is what you would expect from these styles of microphone. The 414 is a little faster, a little more detailed transient response, a little maybe colder sound. The MA300 tube condensers in general, people might use a U67, which is sort of what the MA300 is based off of, from what I understand, or similar sort of use. This microphone, of everything in my arsenal, has the most extended top end. It also has the richest bottom end. It's a very, very large sound. And for a drum overhead, I like that. I want to get all the crispness and detail out of the top, but I also want to get the bottom and the slam out of the drums to help out what's happening with the tight mics and give a nice overall picture. So today I'm going to use the MA300s as drum overheads, but any of these could be used depending on musical style or session. So when you pick what microphones you've got, if you're lucky enough to have multiple stereo pairs, you're going to have to listen to them, know what they sound like, and have an idea of where you want the drum set to go sonically. So MA300s for overheads.
So I've laid out all the microphones that I'm going to use for the drum set, and I'm just going to go through setting them up and tell you a little bit about what I'm doing. For the overheads, I'm choosing a standard XY setup. I've been experimenting some with ORTF. I've been occasionally doing mid-side, spaced pairs, Recorder Man, Glenn Johns, a lot of different techniques. XY is simple, uses a single mic stand, and for the sake of expediency, we're going to stick with that as it's a fairly standard option. 2 microphones, it's important to always have them plugged in before they're powered on. So I like to keep everything neat and tidy and make sure that we're lined up, 90-degree angle to the capsules pointed outwards. And I tend to center the overheads pretty closely over the snare drum, although I really want to get in the center of the entire kit. So for the snare drum, I have a KM184 for the bottom and the standard Shure SM57 for the top. These get mounted to a single stand, and depending on what sound you want out of the snare, angle of approach for the top snare mic can be quite a difference. Sharper angles give you a little more bottom end and de-accentuate the stick slap, whereas if you go at a shallower angle, closer to the rim along the line of the head, you'll get a little more top end. For the bottom mic, I basically point this, you can see the 3-finger measurement method, standard for me. I tend to point it as close to the wires as possible. It's not crucial that it's right on the wires, but that's what I want the mic to pick up, and I try to keep it away from the bass drum. I want snare, not kick sound on that mic. RE20 Electro Voice for my inside kick mic. It's a really great time-tested kick mic. There's lots of great options. At some point, I'm going to select PZM boundary microphone, something like a Beyerdynamic or the Beta 91. Anyway, one of the boundary microphones that just lays in the drum. I haven't experimented with those yet, but the RE20 is sort of a classic. And starting off fairly deep into the drum, getting a little more slap. Outside for this session, I used a Neumann TLM 193, which I have since moved on to somebody else in lieu of a different microphone. But dynamic mic inside to get the slap and deal with the air and the high SPL. Condenser outside to get the body and the boom, which I put usually a little closer to the shell. I'm also using my CAD M39 condensers for the toms. Again, probably about a 30-degree angle off of the drum head and 3 fingers to a hand's distance away. Further will give you a more focused sound, a little less low end, a little more natural. Closer in, you'll really hype the extremes of the frequency and accentuate the boom and head resonance more. So I tend to go a little further for most projects. Sometimes we'll get in really tight. Just depends what I want to hear. And those are multi-pattern microphones. If I'm really being particular about it, or if I have a drummer who's hitting the cymbals harder and the drums less hard, I may use the rejection pattern and go to a hypercardioid or something else to reject some more cymbals out of it. But for the most part, the standard cardioid pickup works fine for me. And try to keep them out of the way of the drummer's sticks. Hopefully the drummers are paying attention to the fact that there's a microphone and not smashing it with their stick, but it always tends to happen. Sooner or later, they'll get hit. So don't put anything too valuable or precious to you that you don't want to get a dent. Another KM184 for the hi-hat. I've used a lot of different things on hi-hat mics. SM57, I've got an Audix i5. SM81s are very often a pick for me. I'll use the high-pass filter on it and try to take out some of the bleed from the rest of the drums. And then I have the crotch mic. This is a EV635A. It's sort of a 70s, 80s era field reporter microphone, omnidirectional, indestructible, and fairly frequency limited. It doesn't do much under 100 hertz, and it doesn't do much above about 12. So it's really nice just for the mid-range focus. And the crotch mic, to me, is the mic that's going to help the drums have punch and clarity when it's all the way down to somebody's smartphone speaker. It's not the sound that I'm designing music for, but I do want to pay some attention to it. And then to add to the entire setup, room mics. This is where I'm going to use my Fathead ribbons. They come with a very handy stereo mic bar, and I'm going to put them up in bloom line across the room. They're about 15 feet away from the drum kit. You can come in a little closer. Further away, you're going to get more room. I've even at times put these behind a baffle so that they get no direct sound from the drums. And I find that a bloom line pair fairly far back from the drum set works quite well. So the bloom line pair figure 8 is pointing front and back, and it gets a fair amount of the room no matter where you put it, really. So anyway, I think it's about time to hear what this drum setup sounds like initially. There we go. We took an initial listen and decided that we didn't like our inside kick drum placement. It was a little too bright, a little too much high end. So readjust and try again. Okay, this is all the way out. Okay, let's see what we got. All right, here's our waveforms, zoomed in quite dramatically to the very first impact of the bass drum. I always record drums doing isolated hits. There's a number of reasons for this. First thing is I can use this as a sample for drum replacement on a project where the drums maybe were not recorded up to the standards that I'd like to see. So to treat these drums, the very first thing we're going to do is make sure they're all time aligned. There can be some discussion as to why one might or might not want to do that, but this is what I do. So I'm zoomed in, and as you saw, I changed the display to samples. So if I highlight between impact on one of the type mics to the overheads, you'll see 130 samples between that the crotch mic and the overhead. So then I can go to the delay compensation window and delay those type mics to hit at the same time as the overhead. To show you again, here's the kick out mic to the overhead. Try to find the appropriate matching spots of waveform. A sample or two will make a difference in sound, and sometimes I'll experiment with it. So you can zoom in on the waveform to get a better view. 97 samples of delay, which is a very infinitesimal amount of time, but definitely makes a difference in getting the low-end punch and focus of the drums in order. So you can see here at the end of my drum session, individual hits from each of the drums. Now I'm going to go to the snare drum, zooming in, click on the beginning of the waveform. Oh, a little too far. I want to be able to see the blocks of the waveform. So zoom in as far as we can, set the number 5 zoom, and there's the first transient of the snare, first impact, and the overhead. You'll notice the overheads are not matched. That means the snare is not in the center of the stereo image. I'm going to go right in between. That will split the difference and put the drum time aligned where it would have been if the overhead had been equally split over top of the snare, centered over top of the snare. 107 samples. This is something I might experiment with and modify. Okay, 85 samples on the crotch. Now the crotch mic cannot be phase coherent to all of the microphones of the drum set. It's close to the snare, the toms, and the kick, but I choose to make the snare the biggest piece of the focus. Frankly, there's not a lot of low end for it to conflict with the bass drum because of the mic that I use, but that's a bit of a difficult situation to deal with, and you're just going to have to decide where you want that to be. We can repeat this process through each of the toms. Here's the rack toms time delay, and then zoom out, go to the floor tom, and repeat the same process. Once this is done, you'll hear that the drums have a much more focused tone. I will give you can download all of these drum samples, and I'll put a link to that in the comments or in the text below, and you'll be able to check them out, experiment with it, play around with this delay compensation on your own. But to my ear and my method of working, this is great. So here we go. A little bit of the overhead alone. Kick sounding pretty big. All right, let's check out that snare. Yep, let's restart the clip, and here we go. Toms. Coming up. Sounds pretty good. I'll take that. AM radio sound, the crotch mic. I don't use too much of the hat, but it's nice to have it in case you need it. Sounds like the whole drum set might end up pulling a little mid-range out of the overheads, but everything is there and no harsh sounds. Nice stereo separation on the toms. I like that. All right, let's check out some of these sounds one at a time, hear exactly what's coming in on the mic. Ooh. Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, not liking the sound of that inside kick mic. Pretty thin and plasticky. Nice boom, big bottom, round end on the outside kick. That's good. Pop. I use a lot of different onomatopoeias for snare sounds. A lot of that depends on the drum. Tuning and selecting the drum is really pretty crucial to getting the snare just the way you want it. This one's a little boxy and tight. Not necessarily what I'd choose first, but put a little bit of that bottom snare down, get a little more pop on it. And let's see what we got here on the racks. Oh, they sound like toms. I'm happy with that. Condensers. A lot of people swear by the Sennheiser 421. I myself prefer a large diaphragm condenser. It sounds more like the drum sounds to my ear. That's the punch. That's the mid-range that's going to get heard. Not too much bleed on the low end. Yeah, the snare sounds a little off to the side. That's my garage. All right. So we went back and re-recorded. Let's see how we did on getting this kick drum a little better. We moved it a few times. This is the first new location. Still pretty tetherball and plasticky. Works okay in the mix, but that's not what I want. So we moved it out further. Getting better. Not quite as harsh. Now, we could be getting some phase cancellation as the mic moves. Our time is no longer entirely accurate. But it's getting closer. So let's see how this sounds with some overhead and rooms on it, what the full sound of the bass drum is. A lot of this bass drum tone is going to come from not the direct mics. The power, punch, and clarity comes from there, but not the body and the tone so much. That's what we have rooms for. Overhead, it already sounds a lot more like a kick drum. Yeah, now we're getting somewhere. The old kick drum. I think we've improved. Let's go back to the first one again. Yeah, second. And the last kick drum. Yeah, punch bottom. That's what we're looking for. All right, so let's make sure we have our proper phase alignment. We did move that mic, and that means it's no longer going to be the same as it was. Checking out the timing again, and 111, yeah, that's a little bit reduced. So let's see how that sounds. Yeah, I'm liking that. Well, I think that's a good raw material for a drum sound. One thing I noticed as I was listening, though, my overheads are not reflecting the proper perspective. They're backwards, so we got to fix that. So if I leave the file and just reverse my left and right, that would work. But if somebody else takes my session and is going to work with it, they would presume I want audience perspective. So I want my file to reflect what I prefer, which is drummer perspective. So duplicate the track, pull one side to the opposite, run them back, and now they are actually at the file reversed to the way that I want it, not the way that I recorded it. I must have mispatched something. Always important that you don't reverse left and right. There we go. It's back where I want it. Yep, that's the way it's supposed to be. Kick's getting there. Yeah, a lot less plasticky top end. Now, the bass drum seems to have had more power before, so I'm going to quickly readjust the delay compensation. I moved the mic. It's no longer exactly accurate, so I'm just going to go in and remeasure it. And I guess an overarching theme of all of these videos is to listen, and this is sort of how I approach it on a session. I listen, and if I hear a problem, and I listen to every single microphone, I want to know what that microphone is picking. The chief job of a recording engineer is picking the right mic, putting it in the right place for the right instrument with the right musician, and really, that's the bulk of the job. So moving the mic, putting it where I want it, getting the sound I want to the microphone at the very beginning is much more important than any thought of fix it in the mix. So here's my samples. The individual sound of each instrument with all of the mics. Now, hard, medium, quiet, quietest. Multiple dynamics, because if I'm going to do replacement, I want to have a few different strikes of the drum to call upon. Ooh. Yeah, I could tune that better. Drums could have more prep. If it was an actual session, I'd worry about it. Yeah. A little bit of loose rumble in that floor tom. And if we're going to do samples, let's get some crashes too. I probably, in many cases, would want the cymbals without the bass drum, but I also want them with the bass drum, because that's how they're going to be used most times. And the big crash, both sides. So that's the samples. That's some reasons to move the mics. I'm sure you'll find a lot more when you listen to your tracks. Well, there we have it. In the next video, we'll go into what I might do for treatment and effects on these tracks, and also the other minimal drum miking tracks that we've done in previous videos. So, hope you learned something that you can take into your own recording projects. Be sure to share this with your friends, subscribe, and we'll see you on the next episode.